Thanks, Nick. Hi, everyone. Really great to be here. I called this talk The Secret Life of Data because I had to think of a title, and I didn't know what to call it. And I think this is actually a really terrible title, because if data is secret, then it's not data. But anyway, this is going to be broadly about what data is and the politics and economics and kind of social structures that we create as a result of this kind of brave new data-driven world that we're entering into. So as a way to kind of think about what I think is going on with data, I think it's helpful to think about John and Paul, who in 1969, as you may know, started to begin the process of splitting up the Beatles. And it had nothing to do with Yoko. Instead, it all had to do with this guy called Klein, who came along and told them that he was going to rescue them from their terrible financial disaster that they were in, because they'd set up this record company called Apple, and they'd run it themselves, and they hadn't done a very good job. And what Klein did to them is he said, listen, you're not getting paid enough royalties for your music. It was completely true. So what I'm going to offer you is a great big lump sum payment, a royalty advance, and I will make everything super easy and convenient for you and free you up to live the creative lives you want by taking the rights of your music. And John thought this sounded brilliant because he was, understandably, incredibly sick of having to deal with all this stuff, and Paul didn't, because Paul had some sort of, to get into the detail of it, his father-in-law was a lawyer, and his father-in-law said, this is really worrying. And Alan Klein's motto was, he kind of did this with loads and loads of bands. He did this with the Stones, he did this with Sam Cooke, and his motto was, don't take 20% of their income, give them 80% of yours. Because ultimately, he owned what I think we would now understand, like back then it was just music, right? But now we would understand that as he owned their data. He owned their IP, and the lawsuits are still ongoing, and Alan Klein died in 2009, an extremely rich man. And this, I think, I'm not going to kind of get into the details of music IP, which is its own kind of specialist world, but in a way, this is really what's going on for us. We've been offered convenience and great services, and in exchange, all we've had to do is give up that data, and in the long run, it's the data that matters. And so what I want to do today is I want to look at one kind of super specific case study of an attempt to deal with this, which is called open banking, or PSD2. You might have heard of it. It's going to come into force really soon. So I'll kind of run through that, and I'll talk about the challenges that brings. But first, so what is data? So data is just information that's been kind of collated and structured, and I think it has some kind of authority about it, but I think most important that it's made accessible, that it's kind of put in one place. So obviously, like the Doomsday Book is actually a kind of a very early example of datafication. William the Conqueror came along, and he needed to extract taxes and rule his new country in the most effective way, so he collected everyone into a massive database, which was called the Doomsday Book, and every single citizen was kind of collected there. This, now we have the same thing, but we just do it digitally. And what the digital revolution has done has made the accessibility and scale of this gigantically different. There's people always talk about data as kind of being the new oil, which it kind of makes like a vague. Well, it doesn't really make any sense at all. But I think it's still like a nice thing to say because it gets to the notion that data is valuable. But unlike oil, data has a few differences as a resource, which I think actually it's important to understand they're completely unique to data. There is nothing else really like this, except perhaps maybe money, but that's a different debate about kind of Bitcoin and everything like that. But just to give you an example, with oil, the ownership question is really clear. Who has the barrels? Or then who takes the oil and puts it into products? With data, ownership doesn't really make any sense to talk about. When I take a photo of you, whose data is that? When I send you money, whose data is that? So, by simply the fact that I've sent you money, I have engaged data with you. Your transaction history now becomes clear. So does the banks. So does the card providers, and on and on and on. And we tend to kind of reach for this metaphor of ownership to understand what's going on, but unfortunately, it doesn't really make sense. And I think what this kind of leads to is the fact that if data is put out, once data is known and it's freely available, then it loses some of its value to the data holder. And this is a really crucial fact to understand about the politics of data. So here's another thing about data I think that is kind of strange. Where does the value from it come? I mean, I feel like I can't go to a conference without somebody kind of telling some fantastic story about how they used to be a regular company or organization, and then they discovered their data, and they were able to draw so many insights from it. Which is like, yeah, okay, fine. But I think what this kind of really gets to is that the kind of the true root of all this is that the products and things that we make from data are essentially ideas. They kind of exist in that space. It's not like another raw material. And what this means is that if you want to generate the maximum value from data, you need to let it out into the world. That's the best way to get the most from data. Ultimately, if you keep it to yourself, you'll have your set of ideas, and then you'll stop. And that'll be that. Which, again, like, kind of is kind of a paradoxical thing about the ownership and the control of it. I mean, if the best way to release the value of it is to open it out, then how do you go about doing that? I mean, we don't release our internal numbers. Why would we? Even though people might be able to tell us things about them. And this is just an example of one of the early maps that was made of, quote unquote, the New World. So if you look, this was when mapping was in its early infancy. If you look over to the left there, I can't quite reach high enough, but you'll see that California is an island. And this was actually believed for a long time that over on the West Coast, California was separate to the rest of America. And the interesting thing about this is that this is an example of how the value of data comes from you can derive the most value of data from being open. The Spanish had, at this time, the Spanish had the best maps of the New World, but the British released their second-rate maps to everyone. And so the British were able to kind of encourage settlers to go over there and kind of start exploring, and pirates and kind of the whole British capitalist army was able to swing into motion, while the Spanish kept hold of their precious maps and weren't able to exploit them to the same extent. I mean, and that story kind of has some pretty horrible, cruel after effects. But I think in terms of sheer effectiveness, it kind of shows again how this data system really works. So this takes us to banking. Right now, the banking system is just incredibly stagnant. I mean, speaking of ancient history, so like Barclays, Lloyds, RBS are all date from the early 18th century, and HSBC, the latecomer, is from the middle of the 19th century. And ever since then, basically, they've controlled most of the market. That is what banking is, with pretty kind of predictable results. There's no competition. There's very little innovation. And the fees are really unfair, especially if you're the sort of person who goes over that overdraft, so most unfair on the most vulnerable. These are kind of known facts. They have been for years. And you probably hear on the radio how the government is kind of always trying to encourage switching. This has been, we must get more switching up. But there's no point in switching because everything is the same. And also, if you try to switch, it's really confusing and hard. So, yeah, we know exactly. Although tragically, the only people who could really benefit from switching are people who go into their overdraft a lot, but they don't tend to because they're worried their new bank won't give them an overdraft. So, what do we do about this? This is kind of a real problem, and the answer has to do with data. So, open banking. Okay, right. There's going to be time for questions afterwards. If you want to talk more about the details of open banking and PSD2 and all of that, then I'm totally happy to go into it. But this is going to be more broad overview here. Basically, what open banking does is that it forces the banks to show their data to third parties. You, the customer, have to give them permission to do that. But in essence, it kind of it breaks open this kind of precious store of data, which, to be honest, the banks didn't even know was data. They saw it as transactions. So what this means is that I'll be able to, say if I want to get a loan, I'll be able to, because this happened to me, and they were like, okay, well, so you're a freelancer, and we've never actually had a freelancer before, so you're going to have to get about 5 years of paper statements, and you're going to have to fax them to us. Because somehow by the time that I'd sent them, they would be out of date. It was completely insane. And the other option was to basically go to a digital service where I would just give them my password and my login details, and then they would do it that way. So I basically had to run around the whole of London trying to find a fax machine. With this way, you'll be able to securely show a third party your transaction data, which is great, which is kind of much easier for you. And for the third party means they suddenly have access to this precious store of data. This is all done through APIs. An API, if you don't know, is basically a kind of secure way of transmitting data, and most crucially, it's open-ended. So I can like this analogy that a plug socket is like an API for electricity. The electricity just comes out the end, and you can plug anything you like into it. This is incredibly revolutionary. And what it means is that you can start to see a whole new type of bank. So have people heard of Monzo? Yeah, well, they've become this kind of sort of fashionable, I don't know if it's right to call it fashionable, but anyway, like vaguely trendy kind of startup bank, and they have pink cards. And what's weird about that is that people love this thing, which is strange because they don't do anything at all. It's completely almost functionless. It just kind of orders your transactions in a different way, and you're like, oh, I spend a lot on coffee. Even so, people love it. But the reason that it's kind of so basic is because they don't have access to any of the data. They have to collect your data in this painstaking process where they give you a card, you use the card, they collect those transactions, they tell you, yep, you do spend a lot on coffee. With this way, they'll be able to suddenly tap into the authoritative record of everything that you have spent throughout, essentially, your entire life. And they won't just be able to do that for one bank, they'll be able to do that for multiple banks. I've got an account with HSBC, and I've got an account with NatWest. At the moment, those two things I have to have two different banking apps. With this way, you'll be able to see them all at once. And this begins to open up a whole new way of doing banking. I should have said I'm not going to go through the whole going back, but I think palaver again. But basically, I think that also what's incredibly powerful is that it allows you to, open banking also allows you to start moving around money automatically. This is again through the APIs. This means that what Monzo can do is that it can, with all your data, it can see, oh, you're not on the best you don't have the best insurance. We'll let you know you should switch that. Which makes perfect sense, right? Because there is a best answer here. And then you can get to the point where Monzo just does it for you, or any others. There are lots of competitors in this area. It's just that Monzo is kind of the best known. Then why stop with just kind of insurance? You could do your energy switching automatically through the system. In fact, you could kind of control all your everything you do financially through an auto-switching system, and this is all enabled just because that banking data is released. The banks are doing their own kind of competitive apps to try and do this as well, but their previous attempts at innovation haven't been that great. So why will these be? And this kind of raises a really kind of interesting question about what happens to the banks in this new world. So in about 2005, Vodafone basically controlled the entire world of mobile phones, and O2 and EE and all those other ones. If you want a mobile phone, they knew you, they interacted with you. It was all about your network and your plan. And then basically the App Store, Apple released the iPhone. The App Store came and sat on top of that, and suddenly all the interaction was through the App Store. And these guys, so this is kind of the classic tech phrase. These guys were reduced to dumb pipes. I don't know if hopefully that analogy makes sense. I can sort of explain it in more, I think it needs a bit of work. But I can explain it in more detail afterwards. The threat here is that the banks just end up doing the boring work, which is very low margin, and they have no direct relationship with their customers because you interact with the aggregator or the thing that kind of sits on top. And then, before you know it, there's like a WhatsApp for banking. I mean, WhatsApp completely killed SMS, which was an incredibly lucrative area for telcos. This could happen, which is great for consumers. But I think that it caused a couple of problems, and I'm just going to wrap up by kind of drawing attention to those, because I think this kind of comes back to the question of like what the new politics of data looks like. So that's Margrethe Vestager, the European Competition Commissioner. I went out to see her in January, and we spent quite a bit of time together, and I wrote a big profile about her. And we talked a lot about this question of data, because it's kind of the big unknown, and it's what creates these massive monopolies. So think about Monzo in that example, right? So you've got this app. It's incredible. It does all these things for you. How does it work behind the scenes? How do 5 different energy companies get to reach you, the consumer? So let's play it out. The Google model is that they all bid in an auction, and then the winner gets to reach you, the consumer. And then you change because you are just a person who does things that Google tells you. That's actually not a market at all. That's just some pipes that are controlled by one player. And all the other big monopolies run exactly the same way. In fact, Uber, for instance, does a kind of a really even more helpful system where it runs a kind of predictive pricing. So you travel to West London frequently, and you often pay the surge price. You can afford it, so we'll give you a little bit extra. That's the way that pricing works in this new model. And data creates these monopolies because there are what's called data network effects, in the sense that once you've got data, you can make your service better. Once you've got your service better, you get more people, you get more data, and on and on and on until you control, in this case, let's say half the market. But because of that effect that you can see other people's data, that data isn't owned, it's not single, it's multiple and social. If I have half the market, I can see everyone else's half the market because I'm seeing their transactions too, because every time someone in my set goes to their, someone who is a customer of mine goes to another customer, I see them. This is, I think, it's really quite kind of likely to happen. Maybe not in this area for reasons that I can go into, because there's a lot more detailed regulatory work to do, but the possibility is entirely there. So there is a way around this, which is to make all data open in the same way as. Sorry, I was going to. This is just an example of some fake news. I think that once you kind of get these data-driven systems, you start getting kind of people faking the data. This, in a way, is what is happening really with the kind of economic system of fake news. It's just people trying to cheat the algorithm. But really, I think that the answer to a lot of this is to make more data open at every level. So the government is talking about making energy data open, mobile phone data open, just on and on and on until everything is available. And this can stop monopolies because it stops one party owning the difficult bits. It means that anyone else can come along and compete with them. I mean, theoretically. But it does raise some very strange questions about where we're going with all this. We started out with the goal of, in this case, trying to break down some really big behemoths that controlled the entire market. And we end up with a system where, yes, the consumer does have more control of their data, but in order to achieve that control, I put it in terms like that in inverted commas because it's control only to use it in a certain way. It's not true control. It's not true autonomy. In order to have that control, we have to accept that everything about us is known. I find that extremely confusing and scary, and I guess worrying, and I guess the word is different, really. I think this is really something fundamentally different. Something has changed. So that's a point to probably leave it on. I've written this gigantic piece about open banking. You can go check it out. It has all the other kind of technical details and all the kind of inside story behind the scenes as well. But in the meantime, if you're interested, those are my contact details. I'll leave them up there.